By the mid-20th century, there was renewed interest in the Blennerhassetts in their home, which had burned to the ground just a few years after they left it. An archaeological study revealed the site of the original mansion. The West Virginia State Park System rebuilt it and furnished it with pieces from the Blennerhassett estate.
The present park was opened July 27, 1980. And in 1984, the reconstruction of the Blennerhassett Mansion was begun. That was completed. It was opened to the public on July 4th, 1991. And today it's about 95% furnished. A number of the pieces in the mansion belong to the Blennerhassetts themselves. Others are all period correct.
The island was served by a ferry that prevented vehicular traffic from tainting the peace and serenity of the environment. But the biggest thing to happen at the island was the return of Margaret Blennerhassett.
In 1996, her remains, along with her son, Harmon Jr., were brought back from Manhattan to Blennerhassett Island and reburied. And they are now at the edge of what was their flower garden, northwest of the rebuilt mansion.
Transportation would take another step forward with the completion of Interstate 77 through the region. And the Appalachian Regional Commission would ensure that West Virginia and Ohio would have highways that would connect rural and urban areas. One of these highways would run from Clarksburg to Parkersburg in West Virginia and connect to Ohio, called Corridor D. It would upgrade US 50, the former Northwest Turnpike. The final link in this great undertaking would be a bridge that would span not just the river over Blennerhassett Island, but act as a culmination of dreams and history as the idea of a connection between the two states comes full circle. Because West Virginia owns the Ohio River, the West Virginia Department of Transportation would be responsible for building the bridge and would work in conjunction with the Ohio Department of Transportation, which would build the abutments and ramps on the Ohio side of the river. 170 years after the Northwest Turnpike was completed, this new bridge would complete Corridor D and create a single highway running from Clarksburg to Cincinnati. So not just any bridge could fill this gap. This bridge would have to be a landmark for the historic region it served. This was no small task, as the bridge had unique requirements.
For the main river channel crossing, we had to meet U.S. Coast Guard requirements, which dictated the main span, which was just a little bit over 875 feet. And we also had to keep a vertical clearance as well. And I believe we needed to stay 40 to 50 feet vertical clearance. That was their requirements there. And the Park Service, they simply did not want to see a bridge tower from their site.
The bridge engineers would run through a variety of ideas before settling on a final design. The original concept was a cabled span of ambitious design. However, the towers would be too tall to meet the requirements of the Historic Preservation Office. The second design was a suspension bridge that would span over Blennerhassett Island without touching it. In the United States, suspension bridges had been a staple for spanning wide chasms for a century and a half. America's landscape is dotted with landmark suspension bridges, each the longest in the world at the time of its completion. From West Virginia's own Wheeling Suspension Bridge, completed in 1849, to the Brooklyn Bridge in New York, completed in 1883, and the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, completed in 1937. Because of their great expense and due to changes in material usage, suspension bridges are rarely built in the modern era, with the most recent one being the new Tacoma Narrows Bridge in Washington State, completed in 2007. A suspension bridge over Blennerhassett Island proved to be too expensive for taxpayers, so a new design was needed.
For this particular site, we looked at a suspension bridge, a cable stay bridge, and of course a tied arch. And of the three of those, as we were going through plan development, to meet the certain objectives that the other players had, the network tied arch best met this site.
A typical steel tied arch bridge, the hanger cables always hang vertical. In the network tied arch, the hanger cables are inclined. The reason for that, it gives the bridge increased stiffness, it gives it increased strength, and certainly it's a lot easier for the installation and also for removal if you have to replace those cables. So we've taken advantage of the strength and the stiffness of the network tied arch system.
The West Virginia Department of Transportation approached historic preservation officers with the idea of placing bridge piers on the island, with the caveat that the bridge would have minimal effect on the environment and would not route traffic onto the island. Historic preservation and local community leaders agreed that such a structure would accomplish the goal of preservation and providing a much-needed completion of US 50. So a new design was placed on the drawing boards, one which would allow for piers to be placed on the island 3 miles from where the Blennerhassetts themselves lived. So successful was the design and construction of the bridge that it won an international award of the highest order before it was even opened. The Gustav Lindenthal Award is presented each year to one of the world's greatest bridges that has met a variety of important goals.
This award